And normally, I do not begin or in my classes give us the scriptures that we're going to be talking about. That's something that all of you have Bibles and that actually help if you're studying in advance. But I do want to start with where we ended up last week. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 or chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. And by the way, this is the English Standard Version that I've got here. Paul talks about when he came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was open for me in the Lord. This is really kind of astounding language from Paul. He had an opportunity to proclaim the gospel, and yet he says he turned it down because he could not find Titus. So what does that tell us about the state of mind of Paul as he has come to Troas looking for Titus? What is his state of mind? What is his heart right now? What's he feeling? Would you say he's peaceful? Contented? He's anxious. He's worried. What's he anxious and worried about? This kind of gets into what we talked about last week. Remember, he said his original plan was he was going to go to Corinth twice, once at the beginning of the journey, go to Macedonia, come back through Corinth, and then he changed his mind. And why did he change his mind? What did he want to avoid? We go back to the first part of chapter 2. I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. So what is Paul feeling? Why does he so desperately want to meet Titus? He even wrote him a letter, if you'll read there in verse 2, or verse 3. This is the very thing I wrote you, lest when I came, I should have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice. Whether that was an unrecorded letter in between 1st to 2nd Corinthians, or whether it is 1 Corinthians itself, immaterial to our discussion. What is Paul thinking right now? It's important for us to establish that before we get into what we're going to talk about in our class tonight. What was his mindset?
I think Paul might be anxious of if he caused any of them too much sorrow, too much guilt. That's what feeling. They might have just turned away from faith completely.
Yeah. He wrote this letter, and he doesn't know how it was received. They didn't have instant email communication like we do now. They didn't have cell phones. They just flip a number and say, well, how'd you feel about that letter I sent you? He sent that letter, and it's been silence. He has no idea how was it received. He knows what his heart was when he wrote it. He knows that it was the right thing to do, but he doesn't know how they're going to respond to it. And so what's Titus got to do with all this? Yeah, Paul had sent Titus, go to Corinth, find out what's happening. Maybe Titus is the one who delivered the letter. But regardless of how this is, Titus is the one who's going to give Paul this information that he is so anxious to find out about, so desperate to receive. And so when Titus was not in Troas, Paul goes on to Macedonia. And when he gets to Macedonia, and most of you are looking in your Bibles at what translation is he reading from? I don't see this in the next verse at all. this part that I've got here, I mean, it reads very smoothly together. It just seems like he's telling the story. I went to Macedonia, I still didn't find rest. And God comforted me by the coming of Titus. So Titus came and met him in Macedonia. But why isn't that what you read in your Bible? Well, I kind of fooled you. That's actually chapter 7 and verse 5, beginning. So why did I take chapter 7 and verse 5 and put it behind chapter 2 and verse 13? Have you ever had something happen in your life and you're kind of telling the story about it, and you get to a very dramatic point in the story and you just stop and start talking about whatever it was that happened? You just kind of shift gears. And somebody might even say that you left my head spinning when you shifted gears to this. That's what Paul does. He's telling the story to the Corinthians. Now remember, he got to Macedonia. That's where he wrote this letter. Titus has come to him and told him the story, and we're going to see that it's good news. And so now Paul is writing this letter back to Corinth to let them know, this is my reaction to what Titus told me. So they know Titus has met Paul. In fact, Titus might have been the one who delivered this second letter back to them. But they know this. Paul knows they know this. And so what Paul does is he stops very abruptly in the narrative, and he's just got to tell them the way he felt when he heard that news from Titus. So that's what we actually see here, which is where we're going to start today in verse 14 of chapter 2. Is Paul talking about his state of mind when he gets this message from Titus? And that's going to continue to chapter 7 and verse 4. And then he's going to pick up with his narrative again and move on from that point. Expositors, the commentators who talk about stuff like this, they call it the great interlude. Very liberal Bible scholars will say, oh, this was written by somebody else. Or they'll say, well, this is Paul taking something else that he wrote at some other time, and then he just dropped it right in the middle of this letter. We're not going to waste time with what very liberal scholars do. We're going to take it for the way that it's written in every manuscript of the Bible. This is, in fact, what Paul said, but what it is Paul telling a narrative, and essentially he gets to the point at which the story changes, where he went from being very anxious and very worried about what is happening in Corinth to tell them how he felt when he heard the good news. So in fact, what Paul does tell them is where we're going to pick up here in verse 14. And he starts by telling them what he tells all of us. Thanks be to God. It's not Titus. It's not Paul. It's not the Corinthian brethren. It is God who deserves this praise, who deserves this thanksgiving. That's a great lesson for us. I asked you last week, have any of us gone through times in our lives where we have faced great turmoil, great suffering, great persecution? Now I'm going to ask you the opposite. Have you ever had something in your life that just brought you great joy, great relief? Something that's just so wonderful that you just feel like you got to tell somebody? Start with God. All good things, James said, come from above, from the Father of lights, for whom there is no shifting shadow. Start with God. Praise God for those wonderful, good things that happen in your life. And that's what Paul does here. It's interesting, though, his language. He says he leads us in his triumph in Christ. I told you at the beginning that I want to try to take each class and take one particular topic and kind of spend a little bit of time on that topic. I had real problems deciding what that topic would be tonight. I've got like 4 different things I wanted to talk about. One of them is these analogies that Paul uses. He uses two very clear cultural references. This first one is a Roman triumphal entry. To this day, there is an arch, that still remains in Rome, that was erected by Titus, a Roman general. And it celebrated the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And it was his triumph returning back to Rome after destroying Jerusalem and defeating the rebellious Jews. History tells us that there were at least 300 of these Roman triumphal parades. And Paul is using that analogy, that image that would have been so clear and so vivid in the minds of the Corinthians. He's using it to describe what God has done with this good news that came back from Titus. God leads us in triumph in Christ. Now, scholars tell us these triumphal parades had some consistent pattern to them. It would be led by the general riding on a white charger. Read Revelation 19 sometime. And that's exactly what you see there. It would be followed at some point by prisoners in chains, showing his victory over them. There would also be a priest or numerous priests carrying these censers with burning incense. And then at some point, he would have some parts of his army marching in their uniforms, swords all polished, flashing in the sun. And this is to show his great victory over whatever particular enemy it is. Those are the things we see in this image. Paul talks about this aroma. An aroma that is to life and an aroma that is to death. Those priests carrying those censers that are burning of incense. What did it smell like to the victorious citizens who were seeing their general marching through the streets? What's this triumph supposed to inspire in them? Confidence, it's victory, it's safety, the Pax Romana. There is peace with Rome. What did it smell like to the prisoners in chains? What did the end of the parade mean for them? It's an aroma of death. They're not keeping prisoners. It's not like, okay, 5 years in prison, then you guys can go free. They're marching them through the streets in chains just to show off. They're going to be executed. Paul here says, this news that I received from Titus, this is God's triumphal march. This is victory over Satan. Victory over those who are trying to destroy the unity of the family there in Corinth. This is what Paul is feeling. He's gone from anxiety to great joy. Now we're going to see not all the news was good news. But the overall impression on Paul, this is wonderful to hear. God's word is doing what it's supposed to do. It's leading us to victory. Now we get to verse 17. Here's our second image. Nope, I don't have it on that screen. The second image is that of a Roman orator, a rhetoricist. I mentioned in the first class that there was a rivalry between Corinth and Athens. Both of them were powerful, perhaps the most powerful Greek city-states. But they had two somewhat different views of Greek philosophy. The Athenians were interested in what is called sophistry. It's a Greek word that just simply means wisdom. So the Athenians were always looking to be impressed. When Paul went to Athens, we're told that the people there were always interested in hearing something new. And when Paul started reasoning with them in the marketplace, they wanted him to address all of the leadership, take them up on Mars Hill, tell us about this philosophy that you're teaching. It was all about wisdom. Corinth was more in the idea of rhetoric. Rhetoric comes from a Greek word that literally just means to speak. It's a simplified version to say this, but it's essentially the argument between style and substance. The Athenians were more interested in what they would consider to be substance, while the Corinthians were more interested in what they would call style, or what we would call style. They were people who were speaking to sound good. Their rhetoric was a lot more about what is the style of the speaker than necessarily what are they saying. I find some fascinating modern parallels to this. As I think most of you know, I work for state government. We have very strict rules about what income we can derive. So politicians are often invited to speak, but they can't take any personal income from that speech. So instead, what they do is they go to these fundraisers to raise money for their political party or raise money for somebody else's candidate. And then when they leave office, what do? They still do fundraisers, but now they're raising funds for themselves. Now, what are they talking about? They're talking about politics. They're talking about what makes their party better than the other party, what makes this candidate better than the other candidate. That's rhetoric. Plain and simple, that's what it is, it's rhetoric. So Corinth was a modern example of the kind of politician, the kind of stuff that you get from politicians today. Notice verse 17. We are not like many peddling the word of God, but as from sincerity, as from God, we speak in God in the sight of God. In other words, Paul is saying we're not like the Corinthian orators who are speaking for money. That's what they did. They spoke for money. And so Paul here is using that analogy, something again that would be very clear to the Corinthians, to help them realize that's not my motivation. That's not why I do what I do. I finally chose this as our topic because it is the primary message of chapter 3. That is the new covenant. Now, I'm going to start with the first question. Is it really new? I mean, Paul calls it new here. He says in verse 6, who made us adequate as servants of a new covenant. So I guess maybe we need to ask this question and say, is it truly new? We should ask, in what way is it new? Because obviously, from me asking that first question, it's not brand new. Anybody remember when this covenant was first given? This is one of those passages in the Bible. If you're going to memorize a handful of passages, this needs to be one of them. Genesis chapter 12. What happened in Genesis chapter 12? Exactly. God made a covenant based on promises to Abraham. We know that's significant because Paul himself tells us it's significant, especially in the book of Galatians, in the book of Romans also, but book of Jeremiah will talk about this. That it's found really in almost every book of the Old and New Testament. So when we say new covenant, it's not brand new in the sense that this is the first we've ever heard of. But it is new in the sense that it is a covenant different from and lasting from, in comparison to, the covenant of Moses. And that's the point that Paul is going to make throughout this chapter. He's going to talk about that this is a covenant that is not of the letter, but is of the Spirit. Notice the way he does this. Look here in verse 3. Or I'll start in verse 2. You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men. This was a question that obviously had been raised. You know, where's Paul's letter of commendation? Where is Paul's bona fides that he really is one who can proclaim this message of Jesus Christ? And Paul says, you guys are. You're my letter of commendation. But it's a commendation that's written not on a piece of parchment with ink. It is a letter that is written on hearts. The gospel message that I preached to you changed your hearts. There's your proof. There's your commendation. Now notice there in verse 3, it says, be manifested that you are a letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone. You see what Paul did here? He did what Jesus often did. Someone introduced one subject, and they took that and tied it to something else that was even more important. So they had asked the question, where's Paul's letter of commendation? And Paul says, well, there's a letter that's not written on paper or written on tablets of stone. What's tablets of stone? Only one place in the Bible where tablets of stone has any significance. Exodus chapter 20. That's where God gave Moses the 10 commandments written on tablets of stone. So now we have another covenant. We had the covenant that God gave to Abraham, which actually came before the covenant that God gave through Moses. But now Paul is going to compare those two covenants. Why is that important to the Corinthians? What does that tell us was happening in Corinth? It had happened in a lot of other places. We read about it happening in Antioch in Acts chapter 15. We read about it happening in Galatia. When we did our study from the Galatians earlier, we saw that this was a very serious problem. What was happening in a lot of these churches that relates to these tablets of stone? Exactly. To quote from Acts 15, there were people that tell him, you must be circumcised according to the custom of Moses to be saved. Some variation on that command. So that must have been happening in Corinth. And so when Titus brings this good news to Paul, he also lets him know there is a problem, Paul. There's some people who are pushing the law of Moses. So Paul is going to take this statement about where's his letter of commendation, and he's going to shift to talk about, let's talk about the tablets of stone and the covenant based on these tablets of stone. And what does he say about that covenant? Look at verse 6. For the letter kills. Now, do you think, just looking at Exodus chapter 20, and you look at Moses receiving these commandments from God, which were first delivered by mouth. Remember, the people heard them. And they repeated them to Moses and said, we will keep these commandments, all of them. Then Moses went up in the mountain. And that's where God wrote them on tablets of stone. Do you think that at that time anybody was thinking this is going to kill us? I guarantee you there's only one person that knew that it would be death. And that was the one who was giving the commandments. God was the only one who knew at that time that the letter would kill. They thought it was life. So why does it kill? Why does Paul tell us that? Exactly. It exposes sin. The letter cannot forgive sin. All it can do is convict us because of sin. So Paul's statement to them is the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So a covenant that is based on law can do nothing but condemn us. A covenant that is based on the Spirit is the only thing that can give us life. Paul's already defeated those people who are trying to tell them you must be circumcised according to the custom of Moses. But he's not done. He said the old came with glory. What kind of glory do we see associated with the tablets of stone? Go back to Moses again. Yeah, it's just like the sun. You ever just walked out on a sunny day, you look up and you look down real fast. It'll burn your eyeballs if you stare at it for long. That's my understanding of how bright that Moses' face was, at least when he first came down. And said it shone like the sun. So what did he have to do to be able to be with the people? He had to wear a veil. We're going to come back to that idea, very important in this picture. So if that covenant has that much glory and it kills, Paul asks a logical question here. How much more glory does the covenant of the Spirit have? Now, we don't have to worry about somebody who is preaching next Sunday that their face is going to be brighter than the sun. But what does it tell us? When you read your Bible, what is that doing to your soul, to your spirit? When you meditate on God's word, when you consider how this can change my life, how this can help me in this very difficult thing that I'm dealing with in my life, what's happening to your soul? Yeah, it's being fed, it's being enlightened. The sun is shining. Sun, S-O-N, is shining into your soul, brighter than Moses' face before the people of Israel. Kind of a side question, what's the only thing that can prevent that? Yeah, we veil ourselves. We just won't allow that power of God. And so let's go back to this idea. Paul says the letter condemns. This is exactly what Brett said earlier. The law condemns. The law cannot forgive. And yet, the Spirit, notice Paul's language here, declares righteous. In fact, I want to emphasize this idea for both of them. What does the law do? The law declares that I am a sinner. So what does the Spirit do? Romans chapter 4, I believe it is. Romans chapter 4. What does Paul quote in talking about Abraham? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him or counted to him as righteousness. Now, was Abraham righteous in himself? Great question. Abraham did good things. He was a good man. But was he righteous in the sight of God just based on what he did? No, he sinned. Abraham was a sinner, just like I am. So what does the Spirit do? Well, that's what Paul quoted from Genesis 15 and verse 6. Abraham believed God, and God counted that, declared that to be righteous. It wasn't Abraham declaring himself to be righteous or Abraham doing something to be righteous. It was God declaring that he is righteous. And that's what Paul is telling us about the covenant. The covenant declares that we are sinners. The covenant of the law, the covenant of the Spirit declares that we are righteous. All right, let's go back to the point that Nate talked about. I don't think I've got it on the screen here. The very last part here in verse, one final point I wanted to make a point. Verse 11. For if that which fades away was with glory. When Adam mentioned that, I emphasized the idea. When he first came down from the mountain, his face was as bright as the sun. What about 6 months later? It was normal. Just like anybody else's face. It faded. What about the glory of this covenant? When you read your Bible today, does it enlighten your soul just as much as the day that this letter was read to the church in Corinth? It should. It absolutely should. It's got just as much glory, just as much power. The answers are just as right today as they were back then. It doesn't fade away. That's the point that Paul is trying to make. This is a glory that will not and cannot fade away. So what stops it? Verse 14. Their minds were hardened, for until this very day, at the reading of the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted. Every time they went back to the law of Moses as their hope, as their foundation, as their trust, they still got that veil. And anytime we read the Word of God, I was actually talking with Dempsey about that just before the class. Anytime we read the Word of God as a covenant of law, what have we done? We got a veil. We put a veil over ourselves. We're not seeing the light of God's Word. We're not seeing the glory. Instead, we're trying to go back to that which condemns. Because when we're honest with ourselves, how many of us have kept the law? No one. Read Romans 3. No, not one. You can't make it any clearer than that. No, not one. So Paul says that veil is over the face, and they can't see the reality. They can't see the truth. So then Paul says, yeah, I've covered some of these points already. I want to go back to verse 4, 5, and 6. Really important that we understand Paul's mindset about this. Such confidence we have through Christ towards God. I don't know about you, but it always kind of makes me shiver a little bit to say confident towards God. But again, that's my veil. That's my problem of this mindset of the law. I know I'm not good enough. But Paul says, I've got confidence towards God. Why? Verse 5, notice, here's the part that I talked about. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves. He is not confident approaching God because of Paul. There's nothing about Paul that could give him any confidence to approach God. Last part of verse 5, but our adequacy is from God. We live in a difficult culture. If somebody asks you, well, what'd you think about that quilt that I made? It was adequate. How do you feel? You feel insulted? Yeah, we feel inadequate, exactly. Because our culture has changed the meaning of words. What does the word adequate mean? Literally mean? Yeah, it means it does what it's supposed to do. It's qualified to do the task that it's supposed to do. That's the sense in which Paul says it. God makes me adequate. Adequate to do what? Verse 6. Made us adequate to be servants of the new covenant. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. We're going to get into this in our next class in chapter 4, when we talk about the phrase treasure in earthen vessels. That glory that we were talking about that's brighter than the face of Moses, that glory is what we're talking about. Who's adequate to do that? I'm not. Not in myself. That's the most glorious message this world has ever known. Do you remember at the birth of Jesus? Who was talking about that? I seem to remember a bunch of angels singing from heaven. Glory to God in the highest. Am I adequate to talk about that? No. But yes, because God makes me adequate. And this service that we're talking about here is not just someone teaching a Bible class, preaching a sermon. Paul says servants of the new covenant. Are you a servant of the new covenant? I hope you're saying yes. Are you adequate? I hope you're still saying yes. Not because of who you are, but because God makes you adequate. God enables you to be a servant of the new covenant. I'm stunned. I really didn't think we'd get this far. Anybody got any questions or comments? I didn't really ask much. Maybe that's why we got as far as we did. Anybody got any thoughts or comments or questions about what we talked about in our class tonight?
I don't want to take too long, but I do really appreciate it. I want to focus on those verses before, but that's to think that our adequacy does come from our Father.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just very, very free. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what this is so great about. It's freedom that we find in Christ. And it's
Right.
like, it's not on. You know, anything that I'm doing, I need to be giving the glory of God, and I need to be pointing that way.
Yep, I fully agree. For those who couldn't hear what Nate was saying, he's just talking about how this is a incredibly freeing thought to recognize that God is the one who makes us adequate to serve in his kingdom. And if God has made us adequate, then Satan can't declare us to be inadequate, much less ourselves. Anybody else with any thoughts? Thanks so much for your participation. I know I haven't given as much time for talking this evening as I try to do. But this chapter just really excited me. The more I prepared, the more excited I got. All right. You remember next week is our gospel meeting, but then the following week we'll pick up in chapter 4.